London Zoo, where we re-red listed them and undertook the conservation planning process. Now, one striking thing about this as we went along this path was that it actually enabled us to engage a whole new variety of funders who were falling over themselves almost to fund this process. So it's a very new way of getting money into red listing and generally into marine conservation. Notably, Save Our Seas, NOAA and Mohammed bin Zayed Foundation kept the faith with us and helped support this initiative. And these are the countries where the Sawfish participants were from, and this is where the network is from. And we're continually seeking to expand that, so if you can help connect us to anyone anywhere outside.
What are those different colors, maybe?
Sorry, they are where the workshop participants came from.
Okay.
Blue were the people who could not make it to the workshop, but contributed knowledge to our planning process. So we basically came up with a plan, and this plan is going to be published early next year. And we have a vision, and I'll just take you through some of the protection goals and actions. So here we have the distribution of sawfishes as we largely think it is today, with the two strongholds of Northern Australia and Florida shown here. And the countries that actually have national protections are shown in the dark shade. So you can see countries that are orange, but have a light grey country, which means there's no national protection at all for sawfishes. And this is the kind of distribution of the status of protection across sawfishes, and we clearly want to get states down to this lower one. So there's countries with no protection, there's countries like India with some protection. During the workshop we learned that India has a fourth sawfish species, which means we need to bring that protection for that fourth species. And where there is protection for species, it's not always, well, it's rarely enforced. Countries have very little capacity for enforcement for something as rarely captured as a sawfish. Even where there is well-enforced protection in Australia and the US, only the US has a recovery plan. Australia is working on a recovery plan right now. And so through the development of coherent enforced national protections and recovery plans, we hope to deliver our first goal. One thing I haven't talked about is habitat protection. Juvenile sawfishes are highly associated with mangrove and particularly with fresh water, and we haven't yet had a chance to engage with the habitat conservation community, and this is the first week we've had a chance to do it. But clearly there is a role for habitat protection in securing sawfish populations. We think the only reason the Florida sawfish population didn't go extinct was because of the Everglades National Park, for example. And as we know, we've lost nearly a third of the world's mangroves in the last quarter of a century, so we need to make habitat protection part of the story for sawfishes. So we're not going to achieve goal 1 without a bunch of actions that achieve goal 2, which is capacity building, research, education, and outreach. I'm not going to dwell on those in any detail. But then we have to some degree, communicate that to a wide variety of audiences at the global scale. But where we really want to go with this is to start downscaling to regions and nations and undertaking the planning at a local level to generate more concrete actions. And probably the brightest light in our lives at the moment is a network in West Africa, which is called Africa Saw, which are going to develop capacity to undertake more awareness raising within West Africa and more surveys to figure out if there are any little hidden pockets of sawfishes left in West Africa. And with that, I'll just leave up my contact details.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I guess we don't have time for a question right now, but we'll reserve it after the final presentation by Ken Carpenter. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not actually going to give a final presentation. I'd just like to set the stage for some questions that will come from the audience, I hope, and also for a little bit of discussion about where to go from here. So we've seen already very enthusiastic plans for conservation action from Yvonne. We've seen it really in action by Nick and his team. And I think the main point for these red list assessments is that the red list is a database, but it's not meant to be just a database. It's meant to be a starting point, really, the starting point for conservation action. And it's very clear that the red list has the goals that their information should be used for, influencing how conservation dollars are spent, how to inform conservation planning, really to help improve decision-making in terms of what sort of conservation action should be done, and as Nick pointed out at the very end, also to really bring to forward awareness and education that can lead to enthusiasm and support for conservation action. So really, you can more or less break down conservation action from these red list assessments into species-specific conservation actions. As Nick showed us, this is a suite of species of sawfishes that he's working on. This can also lead to legislation for specific species. We also can see conservation plans at regional levels, and Mia outlined the gold mine of information that we have in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. We have yet to really turn this into a complete analysis of key biodiversity areas and so on and so forth. And then there's global policy that I'll talk about in a minute. So Nick already talked to us about the strategic plan process, and it's something that we should start to do in fact for many of these new species, or for many of these species that we've found to be threatened. So we have the tools, we have to start using them. I think we also need to start turning some of our species specialist groups into actual conservation action plans. The sharks and rays, the chondrichthyan species specialist group was a well-oiled machine when the GMSA came on the scene, and really they managed to complete their assessments, but this was after many, many years of very hard work. So we hope that species specialist groups will take the lead in a lot of these conservation action plans, but we also can't forget the species that are not included in the species specialist groups. We have to make sure that they get some attention as well. So hopefully we can farm these out to individuals or NGOs or national sort of plans in order to help with the species that aren't covered by species specialist groups. Regional conservation action plans, we hope to use this red list information for identifying key biodiversity areas. This is a method of identifying where threatened species are concentrated and also the sorts of threats that are there, so you can start to mitigate some of those threats. Yvonne mentioned regional fisheries organizations. These are going to need to be engaged because, as we saw, exploitation is by far and away the main threat to marine species. And we're actually hoping the Marine Conservation Subcommittee came up with an idea about a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, to, I can't remember how long ago it was, but about a year ago, to start to do red list assessments by regional fishery management organizations. And if we can do this, then we can start to show these organizations just exactly the whole, all of the species that are in there, that they are managing directly or indirectly. And finally, also for regional conservation resource allocation. For global policy, red list assessments, marine red list assessments are already being used in such things as CITES. Our information is getting into the CBD process. Our coral assessments have been part of the equation in discussions about climate change. And eventually we would like to do, once we complete all the GMSA data, do a global analysis of where threatened species are concentrated, where the threats are concentrated, and use this as a means of resource allocation for conservation organizations. And finally, once we do these assessments once, it's important to keep in mind that after 10 years, these red list assessments are meant to be done again. Fortunately, once you do them the first time, the second time is much easier because much of the information that goes into the database that they use as a basis for red list assessments has already been collected, and you just need to update these. So after 10 years, we're going to be getting an idea of whether or not we're winning or losing the battle for biodiversity conservation. So we're going to be able to monitor the outcomes of the conservation actions that are being put in place. So with this in mind, what I would like to do is start a discussion. First, maybe we can start with some questions for the different speakers in terms of what they talked about, and then maybe get some ideas in the few minutes we have left. If anybody has ideas or some discussion points about how to turn our conservation, our red list assessments into conservation action, we'd really like to hear that. So first, maybe we could have any questions from anybody? Okay, Stu?
Mine's not a question, it's more a comment, but when you come to the stage of wanting to engage with the RFMOs, it might be worth you connecting up with the people within BirdLife that have been working on trying to reduce bycatch of seabirds, and having some success. You know, it's been a long fight, but it is actually starting to lead to some changes within the RFMOs. There may be some lessons to be learned there, or some.
Yeah, that's a very good point. In fact, I was on the BirdLife website and saw that. I wrote a proposal recently about using RFMOs and saw that you already have several reports about engaging them. So that's definitely something that we need to start thinking about. Thank you, Stuart.
Very simple thing. Have we thought about working with IUCN to redesign the logo so it has a bit of a marine thing? Just something. If you look at it, it's very much a tiger's feline something paw and that. And that's my other question is.
That's the Species Survival Commission thing.
No, I'm talking about the red list.
Oh, the
red list.
Yeah.
I just, maybe it's come of age where we can put a fish or something that's marine on there to make it more inclusive. My other question is, although you say we've debunked the myth of the fact that the marine aren't threatened, I think there still is a difference in the marine environment, but it's also a difference that because we're focused on global extinction and assessing it globally is maybe we need to take not the terrestrial as well as the marine and feed in different ways. I think Bruce's point about the fact that you have these populations of tuna that are not connected and they may be under great threat. I think there's terrestrial examples of species that aren't endemic, that aren't widespread, that local populations are totally extinct, and they're very important economically and culturally. So I'm thinking whether there's a way of having new categories for conservation managers, because we're always trying to down-scope conservation on that. So just a thought.
Okay. Nick, did you want to answer that?
Maybe Stuart knows a bit more about this than I do, but the turtle group, the marine turtle group, had a large level of conflict within their group over the global level status assessments, because everybody, well, there's population by population heterogeneity. So they've just been through a big project to unpack what are the syndromes of threat and statuses for all the populations. And the first part of their problem, their challenge really, which may be less of a challenge for us than people working with commercial fishes, is well, define a population of marine turtle. And so they actually managed to break out regional population units for the turtles. Once they started to do that, then the heat of the conflict within the group dissipated away, because suddenly they could all agree on the threats for one particular population in one location and who to engage to do something about it.
Yeah, this is actually a very good point, because you're often very frustrated with the red list assessment process because it's always a global assessment, and One country might be very familiar with the fact that groupers, for example, are really, really in trouble in their country, but they're listed as least concerned globally. And we had troubles with this at the grouper workshop. There were a couple people that were quite upset that we were calling something least concerned with a species that had been heavily exploited in their country and nearly disappeared. So what we actually have done is we mostly have started with regional assessment. So the tuna started as a regional assessment, and we stitched those all together. So the exact opposite of what happened with the turtles. And we're finding that regional assessments, really, in the marine realm, are very, very practical to start as the starting point. A little bit upsetting, a little bit both for the people that have to worry about the cohesiveness of the red list assessment process. This can be a little bit frustrating because they have the global assessment that they have to keep track of. And most terrestrial assessments are done at the national level as well. So those are two different assessments that sort of need to be keep track of. But for the marine realm, you really need a regional approach because the fish generally swim, and are distributed in regional